we've said over the last month, let's get serious about making a dent in how do we deliver insights credibly to a group of people that really, really need them. So it's led us to the Radar Collection. We use this 2.5 year type of thing. The next 1,000 days is kind of our midpoint between those wacky, crazy future people like that are way out in the future, and the short term is H&M going to have pink or yellow on their kind of clothing this year, and the really short term thing. So I want to welcome Akash. Akash comes to us today from Delhi in India. Akash, you've got such a great pedigree of both teaching, consulting, surfacing insights, and I guess for the sake of the Grey Swan Guild and Cygnus Ventures, you will become the head of insights for Radar Collection. So first of all, welcome. Myself and Rob have been going for 22 hours on this day of the Swan. So we're leaning on you to bring the energy. All right.
Right. Thanks, Sean. I think, and thanks a lot, Rob, for starting the session. Great stamina, of course, that you guys have had. So, but then I'm sure that it's been worthwhile. It's 22 hours of complete packed futures thinking. But yeah, it's going to be exciting to kind of share more about what Radar Collection is going to be, Sean, and can't wait to do that.
And it's kind of funny. We do this balancing act on the day of the Swan we've kind of launched 3 things publicly today on these 24 hours. We talked about our Cygnus Sprints earlier, which is our consulting and advisory piece. And although we had launched it, we hadn't really launched it publicly as a group. So we did that. We also did our future gazing for young teens. And so how do we do sense making and provide agency over young teens' future? And we had that team. All of the emails I got back later were just supercharged amongst the team itself to do great stuff. So I really feel good about that. And I already know 55 minutes from now, I'm going to be feeling really good about this as well, because you've constructed, I think, a really strong thing that not only tells some people about what we're going to be doing over the next 12 months, but also maybe impart some of the gaps and some of the insights about how to do this stuff well, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Why don't I move to your first slide, because I think we want to go broad in context and just,
definitely.
I'll almost play a little bit like interviewer here and maybe add my own thoughts where I'd seen, but you have such a good command of where we're going on this. I'm willing to be the 2 chair on this one for sure. So we've called this segment Radar Collection, and for both the live and the recorded audience that will listen to it, just what's it all about? What's it all about, Akash?
So, Sean, I think one of the important things about Radar Collection is that it's about scanning early on for emerging and weak opportunities or signals, as we call it, that are out there that are developing in they're in this sort of emergence or genesis mode. Which is not essentially visible on the landscape yet, in the sense that there's no design manifestation or there is no particular tactile manifestation of it. But how do we kind of catch that? How do we kind of analyze that and figure out where we can start investing in the long term? I think that's in short is sort of a larger sort of a ethos on which Radar Collection is going to be based on, and how do we kind of provide businesses and companies the directions to navigate these signals that are not yet there. So we don't really have, like the example that you said, in like a few months from now, there's a certain color that is going to be prevalent, but we have certain kinds of brands doing it, so we're able to kind of see it. We're able to feel it. There is materiality associated to it. But what about ideas? What about emerging, let's say, consumer sentiments? How do we strategize around that? And I think what Radar Collection is going to do is to provide businesses the tactical, actionable insights based on these abstract ideas, which is something that a lot of times becomes hard for companies to figure out. How do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Okay, so this is great. Consumers do want to feel they do want to have more IRL interactions, but what do we do with it? How do we kind of
Mm,
make sense of it? And that's what I think radar collection is going to be able to do, is to create a sort of a balance between this sort of a macro abstract world in which human behavior exists, and the design and services tangible manifestation exists, and how do we kind of create alignments for that. That's the vision and the view for us in radar collection. How do we provide you the tools and the map to make your decisions, and it's not just about, let's say, I tell you what to do. I mean, there are certain reports out there, as we know, which sometimes feel prescriptive, like we were discussing about it with you, Sean. Like, say, for example, they'll say, okay, this color is going to do good, this material is going to do good, but there's no background context to that. I mean, where are you deriving this insights from? How do we know as a company that this is going to be something that we would want to invest in the coming 3 to 5 years? Especially if I'm a company looking at long-term propositions. So how do I know? So I think one of the things that we're planning in radar collection is to be able to give you a sense-making, pathway, right? Okay, why is it important as what we are saying? If this is something that we think that you should act on, the reasons behind that are so and so. So it's going to be very transparent, and it's going to be very, I would say, it's going to be very much allowing you to tailor it to your requirements, and in fact, it will encourage you to tailor it to your requirements and not be prescriptive enough.
I love it. Those two words for me, actionable and tactical, just I see. I'm this person. If I dial back myself 15 years ago, I'm a senior client. I don't get the advantage of going outside of my four walls as much anymore because I have meetings and I have large teams, and I'd occasionally read these reports. They're colorful reports. I had a few of my favorites. Well-designed reports for me were always good, but like I would always be left hanging for the answer, right? You've just written 5 great chapters for me. Can somebody please tell me how this book ends and like give me some real grist here? So I love the focus that we're trying to bring to this.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think based on my experience in this field, it's either a little bit to the side where you as you were saying, Sean. I mean, there's a lot of great research, great insights, but we don't know how to translate that. I can't really figure out a trajectory from there, and it's very, very hard. So it just ends up, a lot of companies end up just going back to the default other side of the spectrum, which is buying reports that are extremely specific about what you should do, but then that sort of encourages biases of the agencies. I mean, of course, we're all human beings. Even if we have great teams working with us, nobody can predict futures accurately, right? And we have to sort of allow that room for creative exploration. And a lot of the other side of the spectrum, doesn't allow that, because as a company, I am not really empowered enough, or do not have the agency to figure out how do I utilize the insight? How do I turn this insight into foresight? So in a lot of ways, I think our reports are going to allow companies to really understand the trajectory they can best decide for themselves, because there will be a better translation of what kind of insights they're seeing.
Love it. No, that makes sense. It reminds me of that quote, we're drowning in information, but we're starved for knowledge, right? I think having a good balance of both of those would be great. So let's try to step away from our own selfish kind of effort here. We love what we're about to produce together. I think we have a healthy respect for each other's talents. I have full confidence whatever rolls out first is going to look great, be great. But let's think about our customer for a minute. What's missing? What are the gaps? What's needed? And why are we excited by this gap that we can jump into?
Right. I think a couple of gaps are sort of what I feel have been there for a while. I think one of the things that we we're just discussing about is that how do we really provide companies the sort of a twin-pronged advantage in terms of they should be able to integrate insights into their own brand DNA and develop their sort of long-term strategy and plans, and at the same time, how do we provide them enough content for them to have a clarity of what they really need to do? So that balance has always been an incredible gap, especially for one particular agency to kind of, or one particular group of people to be able to provide that. I think that happens a lot when we are talking about sort of individual consultancy, but if we're talking about reports specifically, that happens much more rarely. That's much more rarely the case, and that's also why we would see that majority of the trend agencies would have one-on-one consultancies, and the private consultancies, tangents as well, verticals as well, because I think a lot of high-end clienteles would want greater, I would say, decision making help, in terms of how those insights can be tailored, which is great. But then a lot of times these reports, do not really provide value for money in terms of long term strategy. So I think that's sort of like a gap that's been developing for a while. um, I think the other gap, I think what I'm sort of noticing is more newer. I think that's coming from the way businesses are changing, because we're sort of heading into a lot of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary spaces. We're looking at businesses really realizing that, okay, we're in a situation where very oversimplified domain sensitivity is really going to cut it. We're going to be requiring a lot more broad thinking, broad analysis that is going to probably require domain assistance from sometimes related fields and sometimes unrelated fields. And that provides a very interesting developing opportunity, or a gap, which means that how do reports go beyond providing a domain centric, a consultancy or a domain centric, value addition, and go into more, I would say, holistic ways in which this insight can be provided. So if you're an architecture firm, and you are looking for figuring out how to kind of strategize for the next 3 to 5 years, but as an architecture firm, you would need to now also understand how, um, pollution or soil or all of these, elements related to, let's say, food systems are being impacted by architectural decisions. Then how do we make a report that can provide insights on the same? How does a report go beyond, just architectural directions with respect to, let's say, materials, or with respect to, let's say, aesthetics or space design, but provide them counsel on the fact that, okay, so this sort of a design decision will have impact on domains or fields that are not explicitly related to architecture. So how do we also bring those things into the perspective? So I think that's a, sort of an emerging gap that is coming up in businesses now, in terms of they're looking for, agencies or trend reports or future research reports to provide these kind of things. Culture, for example, is another big thing that is coming up in terms that, okay, if I'm doing a design decision, how is it going to be impacting, multicultural futures that we are headed? Because cultures are becoming more and more seamlessly intertwined, and it's going to become more complex. So it's, earlier, for example, it was like, okay, if I'm launching a product in, let's say, China, I have to be clear about the cultural context there in order to not appropriate something without realizing. So the research has to be strong. But now that we are seeing more sort of acculturation or salad bowl of cultural theories coming more into practice, how does a design practice innovator, how does a futures agency provide them these kind of insights? That's a new kind of gap that I think we can focus on.
Yeah, I love that piece. We myself and Rob were just in a session on sense making and complexity, and the one right before this. And, it dawned on me as we were about to present our radar collection stuff, in chaotic or complicated situations, complex situations, the enemy almost is deep functional expertise. So,
Right.
if we were to do something on the restaurant industry, I think one of the worst ways to approach that would be to talk to 10 restaurateurs, right? And I think that's the standard approach of most research firms. I would prefer instead to have, all right, well, let's get a systems thinker, a futurist, somebody that spots trends cross industry. And the advantage our guild has is we have about 350 people that fit into that box of people that have that multidisciplinary nature to
Yes.
them. We set this thing up called the Global League of Sense Makers. So
Yes.
so I'm looking forward to applying that group to this effort.
Definitely, yeah.
All right, so let's not kid ourselves here, Akash. Like,
Yeah.
If we were selling financial reporting, every company needs to do financial reporting. We know every company is not doing futures thinking or doing futures thinking well. It's one day I want to do like, here are the 50 core functions of your company. How well do you do this? And I guarantee you, looking into the future would be in the lowest quartile of functions, I think. I just don't think it crosses a lead executive's desk day after day. Why will this be, absolute reading for our members and anybody that subscribes to our reports?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the data points that was there in the previous, slide, I'd just like to call back to that is of course there is rising data out there that suggests that bringing in more, a more systematic application of foresight in your company is going to allow you to have greater ROI per se. I mean, that's the most simplified way of putting the advantage or value of bringing in futures thinking. But then there are more sort of emerging and more complex reasons why futures thinking is going to start accelerating as it is already. And I think more and more companies are going to start sort of looking into it. I think companies are realizing that things are shifting quickly, or at least quicker than usual. It could be in the cultural landscape, or it could be in the space of the way industries have to adapt quickly. So agility and adaptation remains paramount, and majority of our systems are not cut out for agility and adaptability. And we are already kind of figuring out ways how can we adapt these things to a future like where we are going to require these things at scale. So a futures thinking, I think, is going to be inherently integral for people to start seeing at least what may or may not happen in sort of ranges of probability in terms of scenarios, so that people would have options to rely on. Because in a time of increasing volatility and uncertainty, I think companies are going to require a lot more than just plan Bs and Cs. They would probably need to have more numbers of letters to different kinds of plans, and that would be subjected to the varying degrees of probabilities that different scenarios might have. Russia-Ukraine war is a great wildcard example as to, it changed things extremely quickly, and it was not something that you can always anticipate, but then certain things can be. For example, the implications of climate change, implications of food insecurity, and how these are going to be affecting on supply chains. These things can be anticipated. And I think naturally so, the companies who are ahead of the game in anticipating the number of probabilities and plausibilities, and they would have, let's say, fail safes or future proof methods in place, let's say 2 or 3 years ahead of time, I think they would be at a better place to mitigate any adversity. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think futures thinking is going to, even though I agree with you, Sean, it's not something that goes through people's executives desks currently, but I think there is going to be a rise in that. We are already seeing signals of the same. So I think it's a fairly good enough time for us to actually start providing these emerging requirements to companies, because the companies are going to start realizing more and more how knowing what may occur in the future is actually more valuable than not knowing and just doing the short term business as usual, because things are going to get a little bit more disruptive a little bit faster than we anticipate. So I think, yeah, that's I would say one of the reasons why I think futures thinking is definitely something that more and more members and report subscribers would be interested in. I think I would safely anticipate that's going to happen. I wouldn't be able to anticipate how quickly that might be happening, or on an averages, I think different countries will have fairly different, catching up in terms of the speed at which they're going to require futures thinking action in their businesses. But I think it's going to happen pan world, as we move closer and closer towards more and more volatile situations that we are seeing in the world.
Yeah, I think if this was 2019, perhaps a tougher sell, but now that it's 2022, at least for the next 5 years, we can go, oh, futures thinking isn't important. Remember that pandemic thing that happened? Didn't
Exactly.
it bring your business to your knees?
Yes.
And I know, the challenge is, it's like, yeah, we're all smart now that it's actually happened. It's about trying to minimize the surprise of the stuff that is about to happen.
Right.
I find
Right.
sometimes some of the trend reports I see are quite retrospective in nature. They've told me already something that's very, very safe. They almost like read like horoscopes sometimes, Akash, where it's like, of course, I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't going to be accurate. And my hope is we'll tell some things in reports that will be dead set inaccurate, but give you enough of a flavor for the reason why, and hopefully be right on a whole bunch of other things. We'll at least hopefully stick our necks out.
Right. Absolutely.
I love maybe it's a special skill that's taught somewhere in India, but it's like you've got this great acumen for 2x2 matrices and every other kind of framework I've seen recently. This was a good one that you had served up to me the other day. How are we going to cover all this stuff? I mean, it's there are other trend reports out there. I love this 2x2. You want to take us through it?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think starting with the 2x2, I think I've just planning in terms of how we are going to, I mean, what are the areas, first of all, broadly speaking, which futures thinking would require to translate to the larger audience. And as I'm growing older, I'm getting more and more sort of depth to the idea that while really cool sounding or fancy sounding stuff is great amongst us futurists, when we talk to businesses, I think they would require things that are going to have that they can utilize to add value to their businesses much more quickly. So I was just always trying to sort of simplify things in terms of how quickly can I, how easily can I communicate ideas across. And these are four sort of blips, I would say, that keeps kind of coming up in multiple conversations, which is why these four axes has been put up. One is, of course, the conversation between people who would want to use futures research for applications versus implications. Two different kinds of people and two completely different kinds of organizations. I think the folks who are looking at reports to understand applications are larger in number, and they are the people who are involved in design, construction, services, experiences, all the things that are consumer facing essentially. The implications guys are people who probably work with regulators or policies or governments, even museums, or sort of designers who are working in the speculative and design space. So that's the areas where implications and applications occur. But we're also seeing more convergence happening these two nowadays, because like, for example, there is this we were watching the Netflix documentary which has documented this very well, which is about the ethical research associated to technology, which is becoming more and more invested in nowadays, especially after the amount of implications that social media, implications in the sense that the amount of sort of effects social media has created, and the application of persuasive design to induce users to stay kind of stuck with the social media for a long period of time, and the sort of mental health effects that come from it, and more problematic things like the algorithms are designed to kind of keep on sending you things that are in a loop. So there are a lot of these things that are requiring even people who are more focused on applications to start thinking about implications, so in the sense that what could be the negative elements of my technology or my innovation that I'm creating. I was reading about Horizon Worlds, Meta's game had sexual assault issues right on the very first or the second day of their launch. So metaverse sexual assault was not something that was anticipated, but it did happen. And I think there's been new interventions that Horizon Worlds has brought in, which is about having like a security sort of radius around your body. But I think there is largely the case is that solutions do come in after the damage has been done. So I think a lot of brands who are even in the application stage are trying to understand how I can bring in implications research, which means that let's see a little far ahead of the game, not 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, but 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and let's see what could have been potential damages across society or across culture, potential issues that may have permeated in our own business ethos when we are sort of cross-connecting it to other larger things that may have evolved in the world by that time. And how can we either A, create fail safes for that, or B, not be quick enough to sort of launch something and do more research so that we can avoid certain kinds of implications like that. So I think that's where my applications implications part comes in. And the discipline centricity and blurring is also something that's kind of emerging and happening. Of course, we have a larger commute of people towards the lower end of the spectrum, which is people who are focused on their in terms of providing solutions for people in that particular domain by people in that particular domain. But as you rightly said, we are also starting to realize that because of the kind of interconnectivity that we have now, and every action has ripple effects over different systems, not just the domain that we're working in, it's becoming more and more important to kind of have discipline blurring individuals skill sets to be part of the table, to be part of the larger conversation. And that's where I feel like some aspects of our reports can be focused on discipline centricity, some of this can be discipline blurring, and some of this could be somewhere in the center, so that we can provide audiences a little bit of everything, but a little bit of the more important things that are happening in the world. So which is where this sort of, I was thinking about these segments, and these segments are obviously something that is going to be put into a more synchronized way when we are going to do the actual launch, Sean. And I was looking at these 3 areas, which is future of businesses, which is obviously going to be a lot more application centered, but then also future of human, which is something that tells us more about the softer or more subtler ways in which changes are happening now. It could be societal, cultural, psychological, behavioral, sentimental, and how are those going to have an impact on the future of decision making, future of businesses in the future, in the time coming ahead. And why would companies need to be aware of that? Why would they need to kind of understand that, all right, there is eco anxiety which is spiking up, and climate change has entered the therapy room for the first time. It's moving from media and politics into therapy room. And how is that going to impact the future of products? How is that going to impact the future of retail? So I think it's sort of like a bubbling up thing. If you sort of think about the causal layered analysis, if any of our viewers would be kind of aware of that, how do we kind of go from myths and metaphors to sort of going up top and figuring out how these things actually manifest in our society. But what we see as manifestation could be businesses or it could be products, are actually having deeper layers of effects and deeper layers of causalities that are pushing it forward. So which is where sort of we're sort of aiming at talking about some of the reports which will be focusing on how the human emotions will evolve, or how spirituality is evolving, because there is a lot of focus on new age practices that are allowing people to reconnect back with their own selves, and what would be some interesting opportunities, strategic opportunities for businesses to invest in these areas.
I do like the it's almost like the nesting doll setup of how we see this in three different tiers. I almost see these as, big, larger, and largest, I guess, in terms of focus. And I guess if we do multiple reports, we may alternate these back and forth with each other and keep our own selves honest in terms of how specific.
Cross-reference them as well, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would presume that the stuff at the highest level, it's like, this is absolute reading. If you are an executive in a company and are going to do a strategic planning session or a annual business planning session or something, this is absolute must read to get a lay of the landscape that you probably aren't exposed to because you're talking to the same 15 people every day and staying inside your four walls. So this is don't get me started on T-shapes, because we've had conversations before about David Epstein and range and how I love T-shapes. I think I mentioned in our Day of the Swan today that the guild almost functions as a T-shape, but you've thrown a few other shapes at me here. What, take us through the blue circles, but also its impact in terms of how it turns into better insights.
Right. I think this is one question that we were discussing about, and I'm sure we will be discussing about it consistently, is that how are we different? And there's no dearth of trend agencies, of course. So how are we kind of figuring out our place and what's our differentiation, if we would like to say? So I think one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is our ability to basically work across the spectrum, or optimizing the spectrum of skill sets, because as you rightly mentioned a while back, the guild is basically made up of completely different kinds of people who have similar types of intents and aims or ambitions or drives as to what they want to do with the guild, but their experiences are extremely different. Some of them are more I, some of them are more T, and maybe some of us are even X. So I think one of the very interesting things that we can do is that leverage and optimize the amount of divergent skill sets that we have at our disposal in the guild. I think that's going to be very interesting to actually see the kind of variety that we are going to have in the reports to some extent, while keeping a sort of an ethos there, in sort of like giving like a Marvel Cinematic Universe metaphor. It's like there is going to be a sort of a underlined system in which the reports are going to be created, and there is going to be a certain kind of uniformity. But I think interestingly, we will be having an advantage of diversity within a large pool of people who are coming from completely different backgrounds and perspectives, and they can add very different kinds of value, which is so needed right now. It's just the biggest risk, as you mentioned, Sean, a while back, is to become extremely siloed, and I think that's going to be one of our biggest advantages and biggest differentiation as well. The other differentiation. So sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, sorry, I was just going to be flippant. I think you might have even mentioned the Avengers. Like we're going to become superheroes in Insight, right? Like, and we all get to wear our own different capes. Is that what we're saying?
Absolutely. I think going ahead, we can do that.
I broke into what you were going to add. Sorry, if I.
No, absolutely fine. No, I was talking about the other differentiation is something that we were talking about a while back, is figuring out a way to it's not like we can provide everything to everyone, but I think we are going to strive to provide somewhere. We'll try to strive to position ourselves somewhere in the center of that 2x2 or any other 2x2s, or essentially what we mean is that trying to be as balanced in our approach as possible. Neither be too sort of, okay, this is what we have found out and this is what you should do and you will have economic success, or this is my sort of raw data and insights and really cool infographics. Now you go figure out what you want to do with it, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be somewhere in the middle of it, and I think that's going to be an area that we'll challenge ourselves to ensure that we're always sort of staying somewhere in the center of it.
I'm excited too. I mean, there's a flip side benefit to the guild because I think we had brought a lot of sense makers into the guild with a notional understanding that they could do some stuff in the guild. But I think, this provides some tangibility in terms of, look, join the guild and you can be involved in some really interesting research projects and produce some reports that you'll be either interviewed or credited on, depending on your type of role. So I think there's a really healthy exchange between what radar collection can get from these extraordinarily bright and passionate and curious people in the guild, and what the guild can get from a really good, thriving radar collection operation, where it's like, whoa,
fantastic. Yeah.
Gray Swan Guild has been seen in the highest echelons of office around the world. This can only be a good thing. So all right, it's one thing to make the promise. I think we talked in a session earlier today on the day of the Swan about how, keeping expectations and delivery of expectations somewhat in sync with each other. So the proof is in the pudding. Like, how are we gonna get to this higher elevated level of insight and foresight here? Any thoughts ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, some thoughts, of course. I think just expanding on the conversation of, applying, I mean, what you mentioned, absolutely correct, that whole sort of advantage of cross-pollinating between people, but also at the same time sort of allowing them to have a certain degree of control as to what they provide, because a lot of times, we know that that's a rarity, even though on fine print you might hear that more often. So I think that's definitely an advantage. And to sort of expand on that, I think it allows us to kind of use certain kinds of skill sets that are, or certain kinds of, let's say, methodologies or frameworks that are not necessarily used when we are making trend reports. So for example, the application of skills such as world building is not necessarily applied in trend research a lot. But as we move forward and realize that looking and imagining, basically the word imagination is quite an operating word here, is that, if you're going beyond that 10 years timeline in terms of figuring out long-term, opportunities, you will have to bring in more imaginative, individuals. And, we already know that, large firms like, let's say, Nike or Disney, they use sci-fi writers to actually figure out what could be their long-term plans ahead. And there is a reason behind that, is because that sort of level of imagination required, level of visualization, level of detailed analysis of multiple variables in a purely sort of a fictional context is missing when it comes to long-term strategic foresight reports. And I think that's something that we can bring in from people, especially in a team which is formed of highly unique but completely different sectors of people working in futures, but then they're not necessarily working in those very overtly seen areas of research. Let's say if you're coming from agencies like, let's say, Trend Bible or any of the big corporations who are producing reports. So I think there is going to be some very interesting advantages that we will have into bringing in frameworks into our reports, or methodologies into our reports that are not necessarily used. I think that'll be a very interesting creative way to garner and apply foresight data. Because let's say, I would love to see how a critical designer or a speculative designer would be looking at insights and providing strategic foresight ideas. Because say for somebody who is in the strategic foresight area and providing consultancy to brands and businesses for a while, they can go through the same blinder challenge that many of the people who have been in a particular domain would go to. So going to people who are in futures space or thinking about the futures, but then they're not necessarily in the area of creating trends or analyzing trends, they can sometimes be removed of those barriers, and they can provide some very interesting data or analysis of the data that later on people like, let's say, who are more on the ground and understand business requirements can translate it even better, translate it even further. But that sort of signal or that blip of an integral perspective that sometimes we may lack for being in a particular space far too long is so integral. It's so important. I think that's one of the top of the head things that I have in mind, which is going to be a very powerful advantage for us. And I think that could be a very interesting game changing ways of looking at trend reports as well, because we do have things like, let's say, scenario reports, which are explicitly sort of fictional worlds, giving you a sense of how the world is going to change. But again, there's lack of sort of what do you do about it in the current time, in the present now, by looking at those scenarios. And then we have the other side of it, which is focusing more on what you should do, but not really necessarily how do you kind of see your actions develop in the future, 10 years, 20 years down the line, and how does it really impact. So, I mean, if you're looking at it from the lens of, let's say, a designer who is looking at far futures, like, let's say, an agency like Superflux, who's, let's say, one of their projects required the government in Middle East to actually step into a cabin and smell the air inside the cabin, which was simulated to actually, be the air that people are going to breathe in 2040, was something called an immersive way in which you can allow change to happen. And those kind of people think very differently about futures, and they consult very differently about the futures. And I think their ways of sort of immersive visualization is going to be such integral ways to, I think, approach change making, approach sense making through reports as well. I think that would be very interesting to see.
Love it. I love it. Yeah, no, it's the perfectly balanced left and right brain that I'm looking for here. Hopefully, I've always appreciated, whether it's sports or entertainment or whatever, just the ability to play a number of different roles and have exerted a number of different skills. So tough questions that keep us going and will continue to keep us going. You want to serve up a couple of these? We've used this as a kind of an axiom for some of our previous segments today at Day of the Swan. What are some of these burning questions? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have no dearth of really tough questions that keep us going. But I think that's the value of working with people who are excited about challenges, I guess. So I think the question comes back, makes a comeback, which is, why does futures thinking matter? I think this is the repeat question that we discussed about a while back, which is talking about people as to why it's going to be important. But honestly, we are also as integrally invested into finding real answers for this, as to why does futures thinking really, really matter. I mean, we know inherently as well as statistically it does matter, but then the amount of translation in terms of companies really getting to know why it is important is something that we keep on quizzing and puzzling about. And how do you kind of make people realize that yes, it is important, and yes, it's going to stay relevant? So I think that's a very tough question, not from the standpoint that we need answers to prove ourselves that futures thinking matters, but how do you make people aware that futures thinking matters? And in a way, I mean, if we are making this report as a vehicle of a very low key, let's say, very subtle way of educating people and making people aware of the power of futures thinking to create transformative changes in the world, then how do we kind of make that happen? So that could be sort of like a more low key, but a more important and integral but subtle, I would say, a core sort of a aim or intent that we may have. And of course, other question be like, how we have future agencies, we have more future agencies than ever. I mean, coming back to the whole pandemic thing, I think pandemic has really accelerated the number of people who are jumping on futures thinking. And anytime something accelerates quicker than normal, then you do have some red flags coming up, which is like, are people just jumping the bandwagon because this is like the new sort of big thing, or a big sort of a word to use? And I think everybody is sort of looking at, or wanting people who can guide them. So would there be more and more people sort of providing, let's say, flip sides of futures thinking, which could be not inherent, not very well analyzed? So how might we become a futures agency providing reports in terms of providing reports that are helping to cut through the noise and provide people the right kind of information. Because anytime I think something becomes a trend or something becomes a norm, or people are sort of, realizing that this is like the next sort of miraculous thing out there which can help us, I think people try to sort of, there's just so much information out there to get people confused. And I think futures thinking is kind of going through that sort of a paradigm shift right now, just like, let's say, sustainability did. And it's still kind of going through that sort of a phase, or any large systems, essentially, like circularity, for example, is something that a lot of people are talking about, but very few people really, I mean, out of the amount of people that are talking about sustainability, circularity, I think a small fraction of people actually know what and how to, impactfully action these things. Rest of the people are basically following, let's say, Instagram or, popular web pages. And it's hard to kind of, I mean, it's easy to kind of get lost in the noise. So how might we provide, easier sort of inflection for people, easier impressions for people, and not get lost in noise? And that's something that I think is a very tough question for us, because there's so much happening out there.
Yeah, and I know we're in development now. I'm not even too sure if, our litmus test may be here, Akash. Why does futures thinking matter? I don't even know if that's our role to play. I mean, I think it may be the output, which is, if you have, let's say we produce print reports, which I think is part of our thought. If you have a print report, it's staying on your desk as the pockmarked coffee stain thing that you always refer back to, right? I think that in itself will be evidence that, yeah, I think our type of future thinking is mattering. All right, we've got only a few more minutes to go before we have to pass the conch back to Rob and set ourselves up for the next hour. What's give me the nitty gritty. We've had some conversations. What's the when and the what, and the, how does it all lay out over the next few months?
I think the next 2-3 months are going to be crucial, because I think we're going to be having a launch sometime in the next 2-3 months. But I think even earlier, I guess in the coming month, I think we will be having a lot of clear plans laid out, and I would say action plans laid out into what is going to be the next steps, in terms of, first and foremost, creating a sort of a roadmap in terms of what are going to be the segments that we are going to be tackling in terms of the futures. What are the areas that we feel are highly required or less required? I think we're going to be trying to kind of run with all sorts of metrics to kind of figure out what are going to be the main categories that we're going to be focusing on as we begin with. As far as, I think, a launch plan or a start date this venture, I think it's going to happen sometime in the coming month or two for sure. We will be also focusing on discussing with many other team members. Sean, I think people are going to be interested in being part of it, and what are the different kinds of skill sets that they can bring into this picture in associations to the categories and the segments that we eventually plan on going ahead with for the first cycle of the radar collection, which is probably going to be about, I think, based on our previous conversations and based on my understanding, it's going to be anywhere between 8 to 10 really strong reports that we are planning to add to our first cycle of it, which is going to be in the next 8 to 10 months, I would say. That's what I think the current quantitative analysis is. Of course, it's tentative, but I think we're going to try to strive to retain that. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm excited to get our first report at the door, and then because we've looked at the business model of doing this as a subscription kind of basis too, right? Like, how do you get ongoing access to a range of reports? Of course, you can purchase one-offs, and we'll give members kind of top lines of some of the reports. But the exciting part for me is to get to a business model that makes sense for this age.
Absolutely.
All right. First of all, I love your design, by the way. Every time I see stuff this side, I think we had exchanged some stuff early this morning. So I'm loving what I'm seeing. Hopefully these reports look similar. All our overarching ethos and North Star. So it's like, what's the one driver we're trying to get to here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's going to be a balance between um, providing, our subscribers and our clients the tools of understanding where the data is coming from, and giving them a sense of the why, essentially, if not the entirety of it, but giving them a sense of the why, so that they are, to some extent or to a large extent, um, they have the agency to understand why this data is relevant for them, right? Because a lot of times it's mostly, I mean, okay, this is something that is integral based on our research, and I think, considering the fact that we've been doing business for a long time, let's just say that this data is going to be useful for you. A balance between that and the ability to provide tactical information to our, I think, to our clients and subscribers, because I think, end of the day, I think that's predominantly integral into how, I mean, we can have really great conversations, we can provide really thought-provoking ideas to them, but unless and until they know how exactly this can be applied to them, their lives, their businesses, their futures, I think we're going to somewhere have a lack of, I think, a renewed sort of connectivity or commitment with folks. I think that's the safest thing to say, is that that's going to be our commitment to them in terms of how we can add value to their lives. I think that's my North Star, is to create a balance between two different kinds of value that we can provide to them. One is providing them analysis that allows them to have a window into why we think this is important to them, so they can tailor it according to their own DNAs later on in the future. So they have the control over it to some extent, and the sense behind it to some extent. And the other kind of value that we can add is that giving them really relevant, tactical, strategic, actionable plans, so that they can start putting it into action at the earliest.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think if I was to be autobiographical about this again, it's like, I think there's the majority of executives out there that believe, whether they say it or whether they would only tell you over having a beer, that they feel like they're being outcompeted, right? Somebody has better intel, somebody has better insight in terms of what the market's going to do. Woe is us, we don't know it. And so my hope is, my North Star on this one is just, if you're a senior executive into any type of firm, that you look at our stuff and go, God, now I feel equipped to take on the future, because I am so much more versed in it. So that's I think they're both the same name. We'll come up with a statement, I'm sure. So, all right, we got to wrap this up. So love good quotes. You've used one here from one of my favorites, Buckminster Fuller. What's
my favorite too? Yeah. I think, I love
got,
this quote.
it's funny. You look online, and Fuller must have just spent half his life coming up with quotes and half his life coming up with a good story, because he's dotted everywhere in terms of favorite quotes. So,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, so agree. I think to a large extent, I love this quote, from, like, I think a couple of years back when I actually heard that. But I think there is a lot of very interesting insight into how it sort of relates to our current world right now, and also relates to that question about why futures thinking is going to be integral in the future. Because this is why, because a lot of times we're looking at a caterpillar, we just do not know it's going to be a butterfly, right? And the way to kind of having that ability to anticipate, or in the words of Buckminster, the ability to do prognostications, having that sort of anticipatory sense of the world, I think that's going to allow us to really understand what a caterpillar is going to turn out to be. What sort of butterfly is it going to turn out to be? Is it going to be a positive one or a toxic one? And we can basically take steps according to that.
I love it. Well, I'm really looking forward to collaborating with you on this, and some other people. I think the action call for anybody that's listening to this, both live and recorded, is if you're interested in becoming part of our immediate team, there's obviously an interest there. If you're interested in becoming part of our panel, that from time to time we'll call you in based on different things, that would be something too. And obviously we've got the motive of being a thriving entity. If there's any interest from a purchasing standpoint, or being one of our clients in the future, we're all ears right now too, although probably a month premature in terms of that activity. So thank you, Akash. Rob, I'm going to, I know you've had a break. We've been talking all day, so maybe you're thankful for the 50 minutes of a break. Not too sure. We probably have to set up for the next room, but I'll throw it back over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Akash. That was great. I'm excited to see the results. It's always, I'm a data guy, and to get from all these sources of data, these new forms of data, to get novelty in front of people, and to tease out something that people can bite into is site creation, right? Now, are you going to pick any sector to start with in any verticalization? Or are you just going to go broad? What are you thinking to start off with to prime the pump, if you will?
Yeah, plan is to, I think, that's still something that we have to discuss. I think me and Sean, we have to kind of get down to the more sort of granularity of it. But, my plan, I think, in terms of thinking about it, I think there will be certain things that I think I feel will keep broad, which is going to be not so specific to particular domains. But I think certain things that we are going to pick up in the beginning that would have direct sort of domains, relevance. Let's say, something for architecture, something for automotives, because mobility is an important thing now, and or probably something from even fashion and lifestyle, as a matter of fact, because with the whole sort of climate change thing, becoming a hotly debated topic and aggressive topic, in fact, on the heels of IPCC sixth assessment. I think there will be a lot of people who would be interested in reducing their carbon footprints, especially who are working in the textile space and people who are working in the architectural space. I think these are two big spaces that I think we can focus on. I was recently reading an article about how India's current heat waves are being. There's been research on this happening for a while, but now we have like accurate data to present that a lot of westernized architecture is actually worsening the heat waves in India. So, simultaneously, while we're providing these insights, we can talk about these larger sort of movements like decolonization happening around in the world, which is like moving away from, standardized ways of doing things and looking at more local ways of doing things that can be more contextual to the area that you're living in and residing in. So I think these are two spaces that we should definitely focus on. I think there's a lot of people who would be requiring data as well as insights to navigate their next plans of action. Like if you're in fashion and textile, what do you really do to kind of immediately descale or immediately reduce your sort of climate impact, and what do you do if you're an architectural studio, and how do you kind of present these data across to people? So I think that's the plan. A little bit broad, a little bit depth. I think that whole T thing back again.
Okay. Well, I always like T, last name and all. Well, thank you so much for presenting and clarifying. I know that there's a huge connection between Cygnus and Cygnus Sprints and the Guild, as we hopefully have the energies going back and forth as we probe and do experiments that are wild and open. We can align things and feed different points of data, review information, viewpoints, points of view, like we do now, right into some of your data to get some extra novelty. I think it's part of what we bring to the table to the whole marketplace, is having the Guild, this free form, loose sense-making organization that everyone's allowed to do anything.
Yes.
Everyone's a volunteer, everyone's a worker.
Yes. Exactly.
And then as to distill that, though, to actually tune that sort of crazy energy, nuclear power, and to distill part of it to either give energy or newness or novelty as you go present to clients, is something that I look forward to.
Yeah, me too. As I mean, there's going to be, I think more and more as we do it, I think there's going to be more methods to the madness that we're going to be, figuring out. And I think that iterative way in which we're going to build things is going to be super exciting. I think that's going to be interesting, because I think it's a new way of doing things altogether with like super networks of people. I think it's going to be learning opportunities for all of us.
Nice. All right, so I'm going to thank you again. I'm going to stop this and then start it. So we have this
Right.
break. Thanks again, and we're going to stop now.